Hi, I'm Brian. This is the fifth video in a series on code generators. Picking up where we left off, we had talked about reuse and extensibility. I kind of redid the drawing here a little bit. The input models now, let's assume that we're doing lots of external modeling. So the input models now are references. So we're going to reference core models, person and pet, and then we're also going to reference the consumer models. So the consumer models are bike and person has bike, right? So we're going to track the relationship about ownership under the consumer ecosystem. Okay. Um, we've also got ref here, Java objects, ref Python objects, ref, actually you need to go draw these over here, right? So SQL 3NF TPL and SQL CDC TPL TMPL and SQL DW TMPL. So these are, template packages, right? And this allows you to really kind of mix and match, right? And now let's also say, our core models, now we're going to create some little mapping framework. And so, our core models, we want Java and we want SQL third normal form. So it's a nice third normal form transactional model for this. And we also want CDC structures and we want data warehouse structures. So let's talk a little bit about this. We'll dig a little bit deeper into this in another subsection on SQL models. But we talk a little bit or a lot about, let's code generate some SQL because it's kind of annoying. But really, in all of these ecosystems, but kind of what I'll focus on a lot because I like data engineering and data platforms is it's not just that we're generating some SQL, it's that we're generating SQL in a particular pattern. So in this, we're talking about, look, I'm going to take my core models, I'm going to generate a third normal form relational database, right? Useful for just storing stuff. Now, let's assume I can also generate some SQL to do some CDC configuration. I'm going to do that as well because I'm going to capture that data. Now, remember, we earlier we had this conversation about enums, right? So we're going to take the consumer model and we're going to ref it through all three of these as well. And really, what we see in that enum is in the third normal form representation in the SQL, we've got a column that is of type enum, and these are the values in it. But in the data warehouse, we might be generating dimensions, and we might be generating, data vault. We might be generating dimensions and insert stamps, and we're turning this to slow. We're going to turn this into a slowly changing dimension. So the next time somebody comes and adds or modifies this enumeration, and then they run this code, and then they put it in the data warehouse, like we'll know and we'll be able to see that versioning. So it's not just generating SQL that gets interesting, it's what kind of SQL. And again, a whole other subsection on that. So stepping back to reuse and kind of extensibility, we now are able to do modeling. We're able to generate reusable parts of our architecture at a couple of different layers, and we can generate transactional SQL and change SQL. And there's actually tons of variations over here. Data warehouses, we'll talk about anchor models and vault models, traditional dimensional models over here. There's a bunch of different patterns in each of these languages that you can produce. So really, we're about at like, okay, this is a core code generator, and it works pretty well. Let's talk about one little subset, like while we're on this model, before we go to GUIs. I put a little note in here that says protobuf and java.tricks. I said earlier that a lot of the times we use structured text to avoid writing a parser for a real language because it's really hard. But it's worth noting that most big languages, Python and Python, Java, like most big compiled languages, right? So SQL lacks this because it generally doesn't come with a compiler. It's more interpreted into runtimes. Talk about that later. Real like computer programming languages have a compiler infrastructure. Many of them will allow you access to the syntax tree. Particularly, many of them will allow you special access to comments. So there's a bunch of metadata programming frameworks where what you're really doing is decorating objects. So you're going to decorate your Java objects, or you're going to decorate some Python objects, and then you're going to run it through the Python compiler, or you're going to run it through the Java compiler, and you're going to take advantage of all of its fanciness and its ability to read those languages. It's going to create a context, right? So input models are just real Java files or Python files, but they're very special. They're specially annotated, structured, whatever. You're still going to build a context. The problem a lot of those engines get to is that the templates are really, really bound to the language, right? Like tend to be, so it can be a little bit hard to get to like the real output multiplicity you want, and the real template sort of divorcing the template from the language, right? Like they tend to be often kind of really tightly bound. So there's some neat tricks you can play where you use your structure, you generate objects in downstream languages, and you generate them with special comments and special decorators such that you can run their compilers, right, as a second layer of code generation, and get another layer out here. Particularly with protobuf, right? So protobuf gets used a lot. It's a really neat eventing language. But one of the things you can do with protobuf, right, that's kind of interesting, you can create extensions to the protobuf language that its parser will pick up, and the sort of least performant protobuf output language is the easiest one to metaprogram with, at least in my opinion, right? So you can create an extensions in protobuf and do markup and add all kinds of metadata to a protobuf file, and then you can get access to it. What's easiest then is to get access to it in the generated Python and metaprogram against the generated Python. So you're actually going to use that generated Python as the input to some other templates to then go produce like useful stuff. So there's a bit of a two-stage trick here, but when you're using protobuf or you're using OpenAPI, one of the things you can kind of get into with a code generating framework is you're doing all of this magic, but I'm also using OpenAPI. And there's, if you don't have a good mapping from like, what do I do with this representation of person? How does that bidirectionally map to this whole other set of structures that I have? You create some dissonance, right? And what you really can start to create is the thing that we were trying to avoid, which is dual maintenance, right? So sometimes if you're going to use a program, like using a programming language as an input, marking it up, doing annotations, using tricks in the comments and special things, all of those are very common input techniques because they come with a free parser and usually a pretty advanced kind of pre-processor and rendering engine. So it's worth noting there's a subclass of code generators that do let you do lots of cool stuff that are based on existing programming languages. You probably, consider that as we're looking at this sort of total extensibility. And now we're going to move on to GUIs and visual metadata.